Well, we've come to the end of the course, and I just wanted to make some final remarks using the idea of the eighth fire as a kind of organizing idea. Some of you will be familiar with the prophecy of the eighth fire, which is meant to be a time of renewal, both for Indigenous nations and non-Indigenous nations. And this also speaks to the idea that all of these issues we've been looking at are interconnected, and in my opinion, tie right back to ideas like the doctrine of discovery and colonialism. Also, the eighth fire is an optimistic prophecy, and I wouldn't be teaching this course if I didn't have hope. So I'm just going to be working through some final thoughts, and the image I'm offering here is of Lake Nipissing, and for me, living on Lake Nipissing has been one of the kind of foundational aspects, I think, of my thinking and teaching since I moved to North Bay, and then finding out that for Nipissing First Nation and many of the Indigenous nations of this area, this is a sacred lake, and learning about the idea of water keepers. And so for me also, this idea that the land has something to teach us is something that has been very profound for me. And in a recent lecture, Robin Wall Kimmerer said, we look at all of this, some of it is very distressing, but we have to get up and get working. And so I've been continuously amazed, despite the fact that this material is extremely dark and heavy and sometimes uncomfortable, that my students have continuously shown that they're willing to step in and do the work. And I wanted to thank you for that. So circling right back to the beginning of the course, I want to look at the idea of dismantling the doctrine of discovery and the recommendations by the Assembly of First Nations in 2018. So we're not alone in this work. There's many, many people working on these ideas. And so I just want to go through these recommendations. So to acknowledge that this doctrine has had and continues to have devastating consequences for Indigenous peoples worldwide, including First Nations in Canada. So this is obviously a very important first principle, that this isn't just something in the past. And this is often the argument people use, well, that's in the past, it has nothing to do with what's happening today. But in fact, what I've been arguing throughout and what the AFN is saying is that it's still a living document and a living belief system, even if it's unconscious. So it's really important to look at it and then dismantle it. To reject doctrines of superiority as illegal and immoral, and affirm that they can never be a justification for exploitation and subjugation of Indigenous peoples and the violation of human rights. So again, that idea that's at the base of the doctrine of discovery, that certain groups of people are superior to others, has to be completely rejected, and not just in thought, but in deed. In full partnership with First Nations, examine how Canadian history, laws, practices, and policies have relied on the doctrine of discovery. So again, this is a way of illustrating that these ideas are alive and well, because historically and into the present, Canadian laws and practices have been based upon this. It's a foundational principle. To repudiate all doctrines of superiority in a legislative framework for implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples, developed together with Indigenous peoples. So we've talked a little bit in this course about the importance of this declaration and the way that it can be used when nation states like Canada are not cooperating, to in effect shame them into behaving properly. And now Canada has signed on to this declaration, and that all these efforts have to be done in cooperation with Indigenous people at every point. Reinterpret Canadian law in a manner consistent with the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples and other contemporary international human rights standards. Now, this is a vast task, and a lot of it is going to fall to lawyers. And I know that increasingly law schools across Canada are including Indigenous law as a field unto itself. And so this is going to be a very important part of decolonizing, is decolonizing the law. Ensure that the violation of First Nations rights to lands, territories, and resources that were taken without their free, prior, and informed consent are effectively redressed. So this is the other pillar, of course, we talked about this, that it's always about the land. It always was about land and resources. And so handling land claims is going to be a central part of the process of decolonizing. Ensure that the doctrine is not in any manner invoked in contemporary court cases or negotiations. So this is a related concept, that the ideas that come from the doctrine of discovery can't be used to justify practices in the present. We also talked at the beginning of the course about the ways in which mapping is not an innocent process. Mapping has political and real implications. And so I'm just offering this image of the turtle as a possible way of reimagining. And I just wanted to say that I think we can operate with multiple maps. I don't actually think that's a problem. I think that's going to happen. I mean, we live in a very mixed society. People come from different backgrounds and they map in different ways. And we also map within our smaller communities and so on. But just the idea of being open to remapping and imagining our space differently, I think is very important on every level, and also in terms of moving into proper relationship with the natural environment. And so even the ideas of bioregions that have come out of science are important here. The idea that the borders don't necessarily reflect, the borders of Canada and the US don't necessarily reflect bioregions. So the idea of Cascadia, that on the West Coast, that's a bioregion, and so on. And I think these are also very important ways of mapping. But what I like about this image of the turtle is it's a holistic image, that we can start to hold the idea of a holistic image of this territory and also of the whole Earth. And so we talked about Gaia hypothesis, developed by James Lovelock, that idea of imagining the whole Earth, that we're all interconnected, that all of these systems are interconnected. Another way of remapping, certainly in the Canadian case, is to recognize the treaty map. And that was one of the reasons that I assigned you to look into the treaty on which you were born or on which you live, so that we have to be continuously aware of the treaty relationship that we're engaged with all the time, and adhere to it. So I think this is a process that is definitely taking root, and it's coming very much from the grassroots. It's been taken up, and as I've discussed earlier, treaty acknowledgements may seem a bit pro forma at times, but I think they're a very important part of this process of decolonization, as it keeps in our awareness that we live on a treaty, all of us, or on unceded land, either on a treaty or unceded land. In her book, Unsettling Spirit, Denise Nadeau goes on a spiritual journey of decolonization, and she's basically looking at how she can remain Catholic and decolonize. And so there are people, I think, who would say this isn't possible. I don't think that's true. So Nadeau is doing her personal soul searching here, and she talks about her own processes. And so she says, decolonization as a process, a calling, a positive way of being. And what I like about this is the idea that this is ongoing. It's not like you figure it out and then walk away. We're in a constant and ongoing decolonizing process, and that's true for all of us. And she makes a very important point here, but to be able to feel comfortable all the time is a white settler privilege. And this is something I touched on in the earlier, that this idea that we get to be comfortable, this is just not possible. And it's something that I've thought a lot about especially since I moved to North Bay, and I've been in many situations where, it's not comfortable. And that's just not something that we can feel all the time. And I would say that it's not possible for white settlers either. If we look at what's happening in BC, I have friends living out there. the climate change crisis we're in doesn't allow anyone to be comfortable. So this is an urgent matter on every level, decolonizing. And so I think she makes a very important point here that we have to sit with not knowing. We don't always know the right way forward, and just keep being part of the process. On the cover of Nadeau's book, she has an image of a beaded medallion of St. Anne. And she offers it as a kind of possibility for the future, this combination of Indigenous and Christian ideas. And so St. Anne is a fascinating figure in that regard, because I've read this and seen this in documentaries, that St. Anne in Indigenous thought is seen as a grandmother. In the Bible, she's the grandmother. So that's very important. It's a very important position. And so the idea that these ideas can come together in a way that's mutually beneficial is a very powerful one that Nadeau is putting forward in this book. Here I'm showing you the image of the cover of Lighting the Eighth Fire, which is a very important collection of essays that I want to look at now. I just want to pull some key ideas out of the book Lighting the Eighth Fire, which is absolutely phenomenal collection of writings on decolonization that's available at the Nipissing Library, and I strongly recommend that you read it. So this idea that long-term stability of a colonial structure of dominance relies as much on the internalization of the racist forms of asymmetrical and non-mutual modes of recognition, either imposed or bestowed on the Indigenous population, as it does on brute force. So this is a very important concept that while certain incidents can break out, like Oka or Caledonia, those are fairly rare, where brute force, like the army, is sent in. But on a day-to-day basis, a lot of what happens is just based on consensus and ideas that we've all internalized. So this is a place where individual agency is very important. So in as much as we're looking at things politically, we also have to look internally. Now, of course, this can be extremely uncomfortable. And so it requires a lot of self-reflection, but we also have to look at the way that we've internalized these ideas. One of the contributors to Lighting the Eighth Fire is Taiaiake Alfred, who's one of the most important thinkers within the Canadian context. And so he writes forms of thought and pathways of action that are beyond the boundaries of colonial mentality. So again, that idea of what he calls radical imagination, that we need to, as a group and individually, be able to think beyond these structures that we've all been born into and indoctrinated into. And so it's not just an intellectual exercise, it's one of imagination and also thinking about different forms of action and ways of being that don't recapitulate the colonial mentality. So for instance, I'll just give one example. The idea of win-win situations instead of win or loser, as that's the binary, that we can move forward in ways that work for all involved. Another very important thinker and activist in the Canadian context that we had looked at earlier in the course is Leanne Betasamosake Simpson. And she says, in order for the eighth fire to be lit, settler society must also choose to change their ways, to decolonize their relationships with the land and Indigenous nations, and to peaceful and just relations with our neighboring nation states. So the idea that this decolonization process has to take place both for Indigenous people and for settlers, and that includes changing relationships with the land. So this again links into that larger issue of climate crisis. So we have to do this now. And I think many people are involved in this process. So it's going to take action on the part of everybody to light the eighth fire. So I wanted to end on a note of hopefulness in this presentation, and one that links us back to the issue of water, which is very important in the region that I live in, the treaty that I'm on. And so we have here an image of the water walkers who were led by Anishinaabe elder Josephine Mandamin, who was the water commissioner for her nation. And I believe it's now her granddaughter who's the commissioner. And so she began the process of walking around the perimeter of all the Great Lakes. She began this in 2003 and called upon others to join her. So for First Nations, but also for settlers to join her. And this indeed is what's happened. And this has expanded exponentially all over Ontario, that people participate in these water walks. And so I find this to be a very inspiring idea, that by our actions, we're both enacting collaboration, cooperation, but also changing our relationship to the natural world and learning from these Indigenous attitudes to the natural world. And I just wanted to give one example. Very soon after I moved to North Bay, the government of Ontario put forward the idea of a pipeline to run under a trout lake, which for any of you who live in North Bay, you'll know that's the source of the drinking water for the whole area. And so there was a meeting held in a local church and also in a government building, and huge crowds came out, and people from Nipissing First Nation were there, people from the city of North Bay and region were there, and it was really something to see. And the government officials actually almost fled from the meeting. People were getting so angry. And so when we asked them what would happen if there was a spill in Trout Lake, they said, well, you know, we would bring in bottled water for everybody. And at that point, that was the point at which the crowd, it was just the anger in the room was palpable. And so that pipeline did not come to pass. And the point I'm making here is that from what I have observed, it always has to come from the grassroots. It comes from all of us. We can't depend on governments to act in our best interests or to act in the process of decolonization. They're often beholden to businesses and other interests. So we can see with the water walkers and these processes, it has all come from the grassroots. It's all just come from the people. And so I wanted to end on that note, and I will be posting some other examples of the ways in which the grassroots, people at the grassroots level have been creating incredible amounts of change and offering us examples of ways to move forward as we decolonize.